Hi everyone, welcome to Unit 6, Module 30. We're talking about learning by observation. Here are your learning objectives, and here is your vocab. So what is observational learning? This is also known as social learning, and it's just learning by observing others. So you're not taking part in the activity itself, you are watching someone else experiencing it and learning through them. So modeling is involved in this, and modeling is the process of observing and imitating a specific behavior. So we are imitating or modeling what we have observed other people doing. So higher level animals can do this, especially humans. We really are observing each other's learning and modeling behaviors all the time. Albert Bandura is the pioneering researcher who's known for his famous Bobo doll experiment. And in his experiment, he had a Bobo doll, which you can see in the picture on the right. And it was just like one of those, a doll with like a doll image, and it's got that base that when you punch it, it pops back up. And they had preschool children watch a video of an adult acting violently with the Bobo doll, and then they took that child into a room filled with a bunch of appealing toys and left them for a minute, and then came back to say, wait a minute, I'm going to save this room for other children, and they bring them to a room that has less toys, only a couple toys, and it has the Bobo doll because they wanted to see what the frustrated child would do. So compared with children who were not exposed to that video, those who viewed it were more likely to lash out at the Bobo doll. They even, so they were imitating exact words and exact behaviors that the video demonstrated. For example, at one point, the adult gets on top of the Bobo doll and starts punching it with her hands, and the child gets on top and punches it exactly the same. Oh, and I should also note that this is, so Bandura said that when we observe people, we are we're experiencing vicarious reinforcement or punishment. And so vicarious learning is just like observational learning, except you're looking for what are the consequences of that person's behavior. If the behavior is reinforced, then maybe I'll try that out. If it's being punished, maybe I won't do that. And fMRI scans show that we vicariously experience something when we identify with the person. That's important. And I would write that down. So the more we identify with someone, the more we are likely to vicariously experience things through them. So it could be a group identity, by gender, by skin color, by just common group, student, etc. So how do we experience this in the brain? So they have found in more recent years that we have what they believe to be called mirror neurons. And these are in our frontal lobe, and they fire when performing certain actions or when just observing someone else. They fire just the same. And so the brain basically mirrors what they're observing someone else do or experience. So we believe this to be linked to imitation and to empathy. So the ability to really, empathize with someone else who's going through something difficult or who has just experienced something painful. So monkeys with implanted wires in their motor cortex, they would have this thing on them that would allow it to beep when there was activity in the motor cortex. So that's part of the frontal lobe, remember. And then when monkeys ate peanuts or saw someone else eating something, this same part of the brain would buzz. So the motor cortex would buzz just the same, whether or not they were doing the action or observing someone else. So this really shows us in many ways how imitation is a big part of why we do what we do. It really shapes our behavior. So you can really think about so many categories like fashion, the ceremonies, the cultural things, food, morals, fads, like the list goes on. And children especially tend to over-imitate us. So especially between the ages of like 2 to 5. So think of that, and we'll talk about this more in development, but think of that age where they're really like imitating and they're doing like pretend play. And that kind of comes from things that they've seen and experienced. These mirror neurons can make emotions contagious, or just imitating, this desire of ours to imitate others can allow us to feel others' emotions. And fMRI scans where they have people viewing a loved one who's in pain, that shows that it actually triggers the same brain activity as if they were themselves experiencing the pain. So these mirror neurons are very interesting, very new, and something that tends to come up in some way or another. So prosocial and antisocial behavior. Prosocial is positive, constructive, and helpful behavior that we see and that we model. So the effects of acting in prosocial ways, meaning acting in these constructive and helpful ways, has prosocial effects. So for example, if you are around anyone new in your work, they are observing you and all the other workers that are on their same level, and they're trying to model and figure out what you do and do those things the same way. So hopefully that's prosocial and it's positive and constructive. Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, these are big examples that they modeled nonviolent action for social change. So again, that's prosocial. It's helpful, constructive behavior. And interesting, Christians who risked their lives rescuing Jews from Nazis usually had at least one parent who modeled strong moral or humanitarian concerns for them. So they are acting out what they saw as a young child. And this is also super important. I would write this down. Models are most effective when their actions match their words. They like to ask questions about this. So if you just say something like, oh, you shouldn't smoke, and then you smoke, that's much less effective than, or you should clean your room or make your bed, but the parent's bed is not made or the parent's room is a mess. That's going to be far less effective. So it's more what you see the person doing. They have to model the behavior if they want the child to do that, or for anyone. Antisocial behavior disregards other people and their rights, and it's harmful to others around them. So it's the opposite of prosocial behavior. So some antisocial effects. So this is watching antisocial behavior. This could explain why abusive parents might have more aggressive children, and why men who abuse their wives have fathers who abuse their wife. So it's kind of like that cycle of antisocial behavior. And the book talks a lot about violence viewing effect, and just the idea that TV violence correlates, and it makes very clear in all the research that it's a correlation, not a causation, because they can't state that. But there's a correlation to increased aggression from viewing TV violence. So and they show how it's escalated and how many shows just currently tend to have violence in them. And I thought this was interesting that 58% of the violence did not show the victim's pain. Nearly half involved an attractive perpetrator, and nearly half involved justified violence. So when you think about vicarious learning, looking at the consequences of the behavior and deciding if that's something that will be reinforced or punished. So not seeing the victim's pain, being justified, all of those kind of lead to feelings of vicarious reinforcement of these behaviors. So does viewing media violence trigger violent behavior? So there's been so many studies on this, 600 correlational experimental studies, and I'm not going to read through all these, but yes, heavy exposure to media violence does correlate to predicting future aggressive behavior. So there's a link between heavy exposure to media violence and future aggressive behavior. Prolonged exposure also tends to desensitize viewers. So there was a study with adult males who spent 3 evenings watching sexually violent movies, and they became increasingly less bothered by them compared to the control group. They actually had less sympathy for the victims, and they viewed the injuries as less severe. So we can become desensitized to these aggressive acts the more we watch them on television. Now, obviously, many people watch TV and they watch these same shows, and not everyone goes out and has aggressive behavior. So this is important to remember, that it's a correlation and not a causation. There's many other factors that are likely involved in this. So what are our takeaways? Observational learning can occur without any consequences. It's the vicarious observation, the vicarious learning that comes with a reinforcer or a punishment. It comes with a consequence. But observational learning can just be imitating without looking at the consequences of the behavior. Mirror neurons allow us to experience what those around us experience at that neural level, so they can kind of explain why we might want to imitate other people. Observational learning can lead to prosocial and antisocial behavior, so be familiar with the difference there. And our words must be in line with our actions modeled in order for them to be effective. And I just want to add there too, we're more likely to model people's behaviors if they're people that we identify with. And viewing violence on TV and video games correlates to aggressive behavior. All right, so that sums up Module 30, and I will see you in class.